This is Dr. Russell Blaylock, and you're listening to the Blaylock Health Channel. There's a lot of discussion out there about vaccines. People don't know, well, should I get all of these vaccines? Which ones should I take? Are they really dangerous? How do I answer my physician who's saying that these vaccines are perfectly safe, there's very minor complications with them, and there's no connection to autism? Well, are these things true? Are you really being told the truth? Well, what I've done over many years is study this rather intently from a lot of different perspectives, particularly the perspective of neuroscience, because that's what I'm interested in as a neurosurgeon. What are these vaccines doing to the brain, particularly the developing brain? The developing brain is interesting in that the vast majority of its complex development occurs during the last trimester of pregnancy and the first 2 years after birth. So a tremendous amount of brain formation is taking place. Well, these are very important questions because if indeed the vaccine is causing abnormal development of the brain, this is something that every mother and father needs to know. Now, what's happened in modern times, unlike, say, before 1980s, before 1980, very few vaccines were given. When I was growing up, there was about 4 vaccines at most, that were given for childhood vaccines, and then you rarely got a vaccine after that. In fact, it wasn't until much later that they realized that the tetanus vaccine lost its effectiveness in about 10 years, probably much earlier than that, and that people should be vaccinated, in their view, every 10 years for this tetanus vaccine. So I wanted to look and see what is the vaccine doing to the developing brain. Well, it's known in the field of neuroscience that if you stimulate the peripheral immune system, that is the immune system that has to do with your body, your ability to fight infections, etc. If you stimulate that immune system rather intensely or for a prolonged period of time, it has an effect on the brain's special immune system. The brain has its own immune system separate in many ways from that of the body, even though they do connect. There is a connection. But what happens is when you stimulate this systemic immunity, it activates the brain's special immune system, its primary cell being what's called the microglia. These cells are scattered throughout the brain. Now, normally they're in what's called a resting state. That is, they're working at a very low activity, and mainly what they're doing in that resting state is repairing any kind of brain damage that may occur. But once they're fully activated, what happens to them, they begin to pour out some very noxious and damaging chemicals. They'll release things like glutamate, which is an excitotoxin at those levels. They release inflammatory chemicals like cytokines, chemokines, interferons, particularly interferon gamma. And what these immune particles do in combination with the glutamate, the excitotoxin, is they can produce considerable amount of brain injury. They can destroy the synaptic connections, the dendrites, these little fine connections of these nerve cells in the brain. Now, in the adult, that's bad enough, but in the child, whose brain is in the stage of intense formation, it can interfere with that formation so that the complex parts of the brain aren't wired exactly right, and that can be a very damaging effect. Now, we've done this in laboratory animals. We showed that if you stimulate the immune system with some of the components we use in vaccines, that it indeed will activate these brain microglia and other immune cells in the brain and can produce abnormal development of the brain. In the adult, it can produce seizures, loss of memory ability, and some behavioral problems. So this has been well demonstrated in our experimental laboratories. And it appears to be occurring in adults. Now, back to what changed in 1980 in terms of our vaccines. Well, suddenly in the 1980, 1985, they began to add more and more vaccines to this childhood vaccine schedule. And as they added more and more of them, the intense activation of immunity of the systemic immune system increased dramatically, and therefore activation of the brain's immune system was overreactive. Now, one of the processes that occurs in the brain with this multiple vaccination of a small child is what's called priming of the microglia. Now, basically what that is, you're putting the microglia in a state where it's ready to react very intensely if another stimulation comes along. So if you take these microglia that are primed throughout the brain, and then you vaccinate again, what happens is that prime microglia overreacts. It produces very high levels of these inflammatory chemicals and the excitotoxins. They're released in such high concentrations they begin to do damage to the developing brain and to the already developed brain in the adult. This is why you see seizures in children. This is why you see children with the high-pitched screaming that goes on for days and sometimes weeks. This is why you see the sleepiness, the lethargy, a child that doesn't want to eat and becomes a real behavioral problem during this period. And I've written a book in conjunction with a neuroscientist in the Czech Republic, Anna Stranica, in which we went through and showed scientifically the mechanism, showing exactly how this damage was occurring and how it looked exactly in almost all of its aspects, particularly immunologically and developmentally, like autism. So we have a mechanism that's been developed showing how these vaccines could indeed cause autism or ADHD or ADD, or even more subtle effects on behavior and brain development. So this has all been demonstrated in our scientific studies from all over the world, and multiple laboratories have confirmed that this process is indeed true. Now, vaccinating a pregnant woman is particularly damaging because studies have shown that if you activate the mother's immune system during certain stages of pregnancy, particularly around that third stage of the baby's development, that third trimester, if you stimulate that immune system, then there's a very high incidence of schizophrenia developing in that offspring in the teenage years, adolescent years, and a very high incidence in autism in the offspring of that child. Now, one of the arguments of the vaccine promoters of these multiple vaccines is that, well, if the mother gets the flu or the mother gets some other infection during her pregnancy, wouldn't that increase the risk of schizophrenia and autism in her child as well? And these vaccines are protecting the mother against that inflammation. Well, the problem with that idea is that a very small percentage of pregnant women are going to get infected with the flu or some other infection during that critical 3-month stage of their pregnancy. But if you vaccinate every woman, 100% of the women will be exposed to this intense immune activation and priming. Therefore, no woman will escape it. So it's versus 90%, 95% of the women will not face this dilemma, or even higher percentages, versus just 100% of women are going to face this. So that's what concerns me, is that we have such strong links, strong evidence in our laboratory showing that this is very damaging to the brain. Now, the number of vaccines that we're giving and the way we're giving them is a particular concern to me. Is that experimentally, as I said, if you take an animal and you vaccinate it and produce this priming of their microglia, that putting the car in neutral and pushing the accelerator, and then you suddenly put it in drive, the car's going to lurch and take off and crash into a wall. Well, that's kind of what you're doing to microglia. That priming is you have it in neutral, but you have the gas pedal pushed down to the floorboard, so the engine's really racing. So if you then activate fully that microglia cell, it's like that car that's going to lurch forward and crash into a tree or a fence or something. The way they're doing it, they're giving as many as 7, 8, even 9 vaccines in a single office visit to these children. So the child comes in and the pediatrician says, well, we can give all these shots at once so you don't have to go through this so many times, because we're going to have to do 30 injections, 40 injections otherwise. If you look at the vaccine schedule, these children are getting up to 40 to 42 different inoculations before they even go to school. So they say, let's give them all at once. Well, that's an intense activation of their immune system, because very powerful adjuvants are added to these vaccines. So what is an adjuvant? Well, an adjuvant is a chemical that you add to the vaccine, usually either what's called lipopolysaccharide, or you use aluminum. Most vaccines use aluminum. And what that does, that makes the immune system not only hyperreact, in other words, intensely react, but it does it in a prolonged way. Some studies have shown as long as 2 years after a vaccine, the immune system is overactive. The other thing is that you're spacing them out about once every month. You're bringing that child in, getting another series of vaccines, 4, 5, 6 vaccines at that office visit. Now, when you space them like that, once you have already primed that microglia and then you bring them in and give them another 5 vaccines, what happens is that primed microglia now intentionally overreacts, pours out these toxic chemicals into that developing brain, and produces abnormal brain development. Now, how severely the child is affected depends on how active its antioxidant enzymes are, how good its nutrition is, its genetics. A lot of things vary, so the children will be affected variably, some intensely, some moderately, some very mildly. So that's why not all children are affected the same. But there's a group of children that appear to be particularly susceptible to the damaging effect of this priming and repeated vaccination process. Now, you realize that between birth and age 6 years, this sequential vaccination with these intensely powerful adjuvants is occurring once a month for about 4 or 5 times in a row. Now, if you do that experimentally in an animal, you're going to have abnormal brain development and damage to critical areas of the brain, particularly the parts of the brain that are most complex. In other words, prefrontal cortex, limbic system, hippocampus, entorhinal cortex, dentate, the areas of the brain that have most to do with development of your personality, behavioral control, and learning and memory, the very things we see affected in the autistic child. So I think that what is not being told to the public is that there's good scientific evidence that this is a dangerous procedure that's being done, and that there is a very well demonstrated mechanism, a neurological mechanism, explaining why vaccinating children the way they're doing it now with so many vaccines is producing this brain effect. Now, today, not only do we have the newborn child up to age 6 getting all these vaccines, now they insist that every 10 years or less, they repeat a number of these vaccines because they discovered actually they had lied before and told the public, oh, if you get your MMR vaccine, you're protected the rest of your life. Well, you are if you get these diseases, measles, mumps, or rubella. Naturally, you're protected the rest of your life. But if it's a vaccine, it may not last 4 years. And they found the booster vaccine lasts even less time, as short as 2 years. Well, what that means is every 4 years, every 5 years, they're expecting your child to be revaccinated with a series of vaccines all over again, to get in every college and university in the United States now. You're required not only to repeat some of these childhood vaccines, but also get things like the meningococcal vaccine, which is a very brain-damaging vaccine. No one is telling parents that experimentally, if you do this, you're going to produce brain damage. So some of these young people going into the colleges and universities are now going to have episodes where they have difficulty thinking. They're behaviorally going to be angry or depressed because we know there's a strong correlation between this microglial brain activation and depression, anxiety, panic attacks, learning difficulties. So the implications of this are so enormous. This is why I speak out. Now, no one's refuting any of this research. No one's saying that this isn't true. They're ignoring it. And then there's an old saying, if you can't answer a man's arguments, all is not lost. You can still call him vile names. And that's what they're doing. They take people like me and some of the others that are exposing these dangers and this research, and they try to smear them so that you won't listen to them. They're saying, these people are anti-vaccine. These people are way out of touch with reality. They just don't understand the science. Well, I think if you read the papers I've written on brain immunity that are published in the PubMed articles, peer-reviewed journals, you'll see that I do understand this mechanism. I understand it very well, probably a lot better than 99% of the pediatricians who are out there giving these vaccines and the proponents that are pushing it. So why would these people ignore this research? Well, billions of dollars are being made in vaccines, billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars. The pharmaceutical company that makes vaccines used to depend on drug development for their profits. Well, unfortunately, they're not coming up with a lot of new drugs, and they're not selling as well as they'd like to. They depend on 1, 2, 3 drugs to be their big sellers to make most of their profits. Well, one of the big profit makers that's continuous is vaccines. That's because everyone has to get a vaccine. So if they can promote mandatory vaccines for the flu vaccine or hepatitis B or something else, that means instant profits guaranteed for a lifetime for these companies. Then all they have to do is produce studies that say, well, the vaccine doesn't last long, so you're going to need to have it repeated every so often. And then they can produce other studies. Oh, the child and the university is at risk of meningococcal meningitis, and therefore you need to vaccinate all children against meningococcal meningitis when they know that the risk of meningococcal meningitis in a university setting is infinitesimally low. And of course, when I went to university, I never heard of a single person getting meningococcal meningitis. So it was not a problem until recently, and of course a lot of it has to do with binge drinking, staying up late, partying, poor diet, all of which impairs the immune system, makes you susceptible to these infections. So they have a very powerful vested interest in scaring people into taking these vaccines and getting legislation passed that would force people to take vaccines against their will. And they have a vested interest in covering up this massive amount of research that points out these dangers. If we look at the VAERS system, which is the Vaccine Adverse Event Recording System for the government, where doctors can give the information on vaccine complications in their own patients, their own practices, what we see, only about 5 to 10% of vaccine complications are ever reported. Now, that's official. So that means the tens of thousands of complications that are reported every year to the VAERS system is a drop in the bucket. You have to multiply that times 9. So instead of 20, 30,000 complications that they have recorded, there's probably hundreds of thousands or even 1 million complications that go unreported. So the impact of what's actually happening with this vaccine policy is far greater than you'll ever hear about. And the media, of course, because of the advertisements, because of the pressure of the government, they're not going to report these stories. So I hope this has cleared up some of these problems that you're going to be faced with vaccines, particularly your children, even adolescents, older people. And you need to understand, for instance, in the older people, with the vaccines for pneumococcal meningitis, pneumococcal disease, the pneumonia, the studies have shown, long-term studies, that the vaccine is ineffective. It did not reduce death in the elderly, did not reduce hospitalizations in the elderly. And these are studies that are lasting as long as 20 years. This shows it has no impact whatsoever. So when you look at flu vaccine, which had the 20-year study, and you look at the pneumococcal vaccine, which had a shorter study, we're still saying that it has no impact on the things that drives people to get the vaccine through fear. That is hospitalization and death from the flu and death from pneumonia. So what they're doing is they're lying to you. And the purpose of this podcast is to bring the truth. I thank you for listening. The information contained within these programs is not intended to replace or contradict that of your physician. This information is for educational purposes only.